corners of South Dakota this week praising the weather. I must say it's a great relief. I have, ever since sometime before Thanksgiving, been freezing stiff in Wisconsin, Minnesota, Indiana, Ohio, Pennsylvania, all kinds of cold northern states, and it's a great relief to get into a state with South in the name. And every time I say that, why, you modest South Dakotans protest that your weather sometimes is pretty bad, but I can hardly believe it. Well, we're here to talk about the farm situation. And we're Farmers Union leaders, and we're here to talk about the Farmers Union situation. And both are in a terrible fix. I don't need to belabor the statistics of the farmers' situation. Wheat prices in November averaged 49% of parity. That's up from about 45% of parity in June and July. That doesn't even get to the basement floor. That's the lowest wheat prices have ever been in history, except for 1931 and 32. And they're still there. Lowest in history. And when you average in some of the more prosperous farmers, like the dairy farmers of my home state of Wisconsin, and I'll tell you a little bit about how they got that way, they're getting 76% of parity now. They're pretty close to rich, relatively. But all farm prices averaged in November 66% of parity. Never in history have farm prices had such low purchasing power except 1931 and 32, as they have now. And don't let anybody tell you that parity is old-fashioned and doesn't count. The only people that try to say that are those who are responsible for keeping farm prices at the kinds of levels that have been promised in political campaigns or under the law, and they'll tell you that parity doesn't make any difference when they have a record that they can't really defend. And I think that there's something that is of more than mere incidental interest in the fact that the purchasing power of farm products now is the lowest since Franklin Roosevelt was elected president. And I'm going to talk a little more about that a little later. And looking at, we've gotten rid of two-thirds of the farmers since that time. But even so, the average net income per farm in 1977, just over 2 million farms, is running at about $7,600 per farm. Now that isn't very much net income for the average American farm today. And even that net income, these 1977 dollars aren't worth very much anymore after devaluations and all the rest of the monkey business that went on in the last 10 years. If you relate the value of today's dollars just back to 1967, which isn't terribly long ago, and translate the average net income per farm into 1967 dollars, is $4,080 a farm. That's the purchasing power of the average net income per farm. And if you lump in all the farmers together, the total net income of all farmers in 1977 is now projected by the President's Council of Economic Advisors at $21 billion. Well, that means about $10 billion of 1967 dollars. And that is about the lowest of total net income of farmers in real purchasing power since the Depression. Last year, or this year, farmers increased their borrowings by $16 billion while they were getting total net income as a total return for all their labor and all their investment and all their risk and all their management of $21 billion. Farmers borrowed about 3/4 as much as all the money they took in over expenses this year. Now what that means is that farmers are borrowing money to cover their losses. Some of that money was borrowed to help a son pay off brothers and sisters when the land was transferred from one generation to another, or to on a mortgage loan from a bank if somebody wanted to borrow the money to start farming. Very little of it was healthy borrowing. As an economist looks at it, healthy borrowing is when you borrow money with the expectation that it will earn you enough. What you're doing with that money will earn you enough so that you'll be able to pay off the loan in a reasonable time and pay interest while you've got the debt. Farmers aren't borrowing on that basis today, and you know it. They are not assured that they'll increase their production and out of that increased production be able to pay the interest and principal on what they borrow. They're primarily borrowing to cover their losses and hanging on. And I think that's a very dangerous situation and a very dangerous menace to the future of our farming system. Secretary Berglund says time after time that he will not be a party to keeping farm prices at a level high enough to keep land prices going up. Well, I don't think Secretary Berglund understands very much about why land prices are going up. And I think he understands even less about what it will mean if land prices are forced down. As soon as land prices stop rising in value, farmers that are up against it won't be able to borrow on the increased value of their land in order to cover their losses and stay in business. And I know that you can't go on borrowing money to cover your losses permanently, nor even for very long, without getting into a deeper and deeper and deeper hole, but at least it keeps you alive until maybe something will break. And I think that's the situation we're in. But if we have a general decline in land prices, that's going to puncture the balloon and create a land price panic, and we're all going to be in desperate trouble. And I think that might wipe out family farming in just one relatively brief panic. What's going to happen to those farmers that are borrowing to cover their losses, to pay interest on the debts they already have, which is now what's going on? If the land price starts going down, and that's already beginning, it's reported in Illinois and Iowa that the land prices are going down. If land prices start to break, bankers are going to start to get skittish. They're going to start stopping increasing the debt in order to cover the farmers' losses. Then they're going to start foreclosing and trying to sell farms, and there will be more farms coming on the market than the market will stand, and one more farm per state than the market will pay, just like one more bushel of wheat in the supply that the market will take starts to break the price. And we could be off to the races with an agricultural economic disaster. Maybe we'll talk a little later about what some of the real reasons are for the increase in land prices, what we might do about it. I make no mistake about it. Secretary Berglund said not long ago, farm prices are not made in Washington, they're made in the marketplace. Well, we in the Farmers Union have been saying for a long time, and we've been saying truly, farm prices are made in Washington, D.C. And that today is truer than ever before in history. It's still true, and it's truer than ever. The world market prices are made in Washington, D.C., and they're being made too low. Now just take account of the world economy. 3/4 of all the farm commodities produced in this world are sold by farmers and consumed by consumers at prices higher than American farmers get. 3/4 or more. The only farmers in the world that get prices as low or close to as low as we get in the United States are farmers that live in exporting countries whose price is made by American competition. And the American price is made in Washington, D.C. when the government sets the price support loan rate on the major commodities. And it is the American government's price support loan policy that makes the world market price and keeps it unfairly low, the lowest since the Hoover era. All the other countries in the world, with the exception of the United States, think farm prices in the world market are too low and ought to be higher. Most of the other countries maintain prices for their farmers 2 and more times as high as our farmers get. Uncle Sam is the world champion cheapskate when it comes to paying farmers for food. Uncle Sam is paying farmers the cut rate price for food far below the cost of production to his own farmers and beating down the price for the 1/5 of the world's agricultural production produced in countries like Argentina, Australia, and Canada that can't support their farmers at a price bigger than the world market, or much bigger than the world market will allow. It isn't hard to understand why this is so. The United States accounts for over half of all the grain that moves across national borders into international trade. Next biggest is Canada. Canada exports 1/4 as much grain into the world market as we do. And then following after Canada, accounting for most of the rest of it, is Argentina and Australia. And Argentina and Australia together account for 1/4 as much as the United States. Now, in that kind of a situation, where the one seller accounts for way over half, year after year, of all the product that's put on the market, and the next biggest account for small fractions as much, in that kind of a marketing situation, it doesn't take much guessing to know that what the United States does is what determines what the world price will be. And that's the way it is. All these other countries, the price that can be received by their farmers and the price at which they sell their product is established by the U.S. price support loan rate. If the U.S. price support loan rate were lower, you know, Ford raised it from, what was it, $1.47 a bushel to 2 1/4. And the only justification for leaving it at 2 1/4 is because that's where President Ford put it. And President Carter doesn't have the nerve to do better. But why is our government maintaining this policy? Why are we doing it? Now, this is a policy that is different from anything that's been done by an American government since Hoover. Why are we doing it? Well, one thing they say, we've got to stay competitive in the world market. I have personally, the Farmers Union, we have talked about this problem with representatives of the governments in key positions in Canada, Australia, and Argentina. I've talked to members of the Canadian Wheat Board. I've talked to the Secretary of Agriculture of Argentina about this problem. I have communicated by telegram with the Wheat Board in Australia, and every one of those governments would like to raise their price that they can pay their farmers because their farmers aren't getting their cost of production, and they would do it if we would raise our price in the world market by increasing our loan rate. It's our loan rate, our price support loan rate, that sets the world market price for these products. And even more than that, every one of those governments, which accounts for 4/5 of all the grain in world trade, the only governments that really count in the world market, and other smaller governments that account for little dabs of it also would collaborate and cooperate in maintaining their fair share of the reserve that might need to be held at any given time for 2 reasons. we need to hold those reserves. One would be to maintain a fair price that will return a decent income to farmers. The other is that the world's consumers need to have a reserve of grain. Good purposes. The government of Canada can and will carry reserves and has done so in the past. The government of Australia now has the capability and the will to carry reserves and is doing so. The Secretary of Agriculture of Argentina told me that he intends to, and it has now since been announced publicly, to build storage capacity so that the Argentines can store grain, and they're going to work out a deal to borrow money from the World Bank so that they can cover the costs and advance the money back to their farmers on the grain that they carry in reserve. So the rest of the world, the competition so-called, wants a higher price. The competition wants to participate in carrying reserves to hold it off the market to maintain a higher price. So who's the competition? We are our own competition. It's the United States that's the problem. And they say, our government now says we might price ourselves out of the market. Well, that is preposterous. Practically every importing country that buys our wheat raises the price on it before they'll let their own consumers get it, because our price is too cheap for them to stand. Our price is too cheap to go into their market without doing more damage to their own farmers than they're willing to tolerate. The Japanese government makes twice as much or more on every bushel of American wheat that they buy from us than the American farmer gets for it. The European governments make as much or more than as much on every bushel of wheat that they buy from us as the American farmer gets as a total price for our wheat. Just think of it. They double and triple our price before they'll sell it to their own consumers. So price ourselves out of the market? What we're doing is simply enabling other governments to profit on our wheat while taking it from our own farmers at less than the cost of production. And another of these phony excuses is that there is a great, crushing, burdensome surplus of grain in the world, and that's got our wheat price busted. This is another fiction. This is just another excuse. There is not a burdensome surplus of grain in this world. The world's grain supply is tight. The grain supply in the world today would be wiped out by one single bad crop year, such as we have experienced twice within the past half dozen years. One single year will wipe it out. So it's not that we really have such a big surplus. The surplus is a phony. We barely have an adequate reserve of grain in this world. Now, one thing we do have, we have the capability in the United States, invented by the Nixon administration, to create an artificial surplus in the American market to bust the price for American farmers any time the government of the United States wants to do it. And the government of the United States wanted to do it in 1973, and they did it with export embargoes on some 40 agricultural commodities. And the government of the United States wanted to do it in 1975, and they did it again with export embargoes called by a different name. I can't even remember what it was. But they invented new names year after year for the same old thing, all for the same purpose of busting the price for the American farmer, when there were customers around the world who wanted our food and had the money to pay for it and were willing to pay higher prices than the American government wanted American farmers to get. That capability still exists. The Republicans have demonstrated that they will use that ability to create an artificial surplus in our market to bust the price. And don't forget that Jimmy Carter promised there would be no export embargoes and withdrew that promise within hours after he made it. And so I don't think we can rely on either a Democratic or a Republican administration not to use the power that the government of the United States possesses to create an artificial surplus in our market to keep the price down. And that is one of our major problems as farmers. Not the real surplus. This world is short of food. This world is short of food in relation to market demand and potential market demand. But our problem is the artificial surplus that can be and probably will be created by our government to bust our price if it looks like farmers might have a chance to make too much. The real reason that our price is being kept down is that our government is committed to a cheap food policy. If you look back over the past 30 years, you'll observe that prices reached parity, farm prices reached parity during World War II, and farm prices never averaged below parity all through the term, the 8 years of Harry Truman's 2 terms. Farm prices averaged 100% of parity in 1952, and they went below parity as soon as Benson became Secretary of Agriculture in 1953. And farm prices in real terms, in real purchasing power, have been drifting down steadily since 1950. And the only exception was when the world finally ran out of food in 1972 and 73. And farm prices averaged above parity for just a few months, sometime in 1973, until export embargoes were used to bust them back again. Well, with farm prices constantly going down in real purchasing power, that has made it easy for everybody else to raise their prices and their wages and their costs and their commissions and their fees and their take out of the economy. And that's what's happened. The American cost of living index rose just about 1% a year for 25 years, with lower farm prices offsetting higher costs and prices for everything else. And so that is the political purpose of a cheap food policy. The farmer is the easiest goose to catch. So it's the farmer that gets plucked to make life soft for everybody else. And that's what's been going on for a generation. And that's what governments still want to go on. And that's why we have a cheap food policy. And that's the fix we're in, and that's a tough fix for farmers, which you know as farmers, and it's also a tough fix for the Farmers Union. I suppose that most of us who are here today are Democrats. I'm one myself. We have believed, and we have persuaded other farmers to believe, that once we got rid of Benson, things would be better. Once we got rid of Butts, things would be better, and so on. We have believed the promise of parity that was first made, that was invented by Republicans, progressive Republicans in the 1920s, and was taken over and made official government policy by President Roosevelt in the 1930s, and which was delivered and maintained by President Truman up until 1952, and which a promise that was renewed by President Kennedy when he ran for office had promised parity of income. And I wrote the words that went into the Democratic platform. And it has now been repudiated by Secretary Berglund and President Carter. The promise of parity is over. We're not going to get parity from the government unless we can do something different from what we've done. I think we've come to a double-jointed turning point in history. And one change is that we no longer have any right in our, if we're mentally sound and competent mind, to believe that the government, the right government, if we can win the right election, that the government is going to give us parity or anything like it. That's one turning point. And another is that for the first time in more than 100 years, the capability to produce food in this world has now been overtaken by the capability to buy food on the average. I think that the era of surpluses that has lasted for a century and more is now over. Now that doesn't mean that we won't have more than we need to eat some years, as we have right now. And it doesn't mean that we won't have artificial surpluses just about any time in the foreseeable future that the government of the United States wants to force them on us. But it does mean that we are not likely to see, I believe, any time when we have the ability to produce surpluses year after year after year, as we did in the 1950s and the 1960s. If we were to reduce the unemployment rate in the industrialized countries by 1 percentage point, to reduce the unemployment rate from 7% in the United States down to 6, from 4% in Germany down to 3, from 6 or 7% in England down 1 point, just that little change in the additional demand that would be created within a few months would have us down to scratch and barely break even on food supply. And of course, if we were to have the kind of world prosperity that we had all over the world with rising incomes in the developing countries, as we had in 1972 and 73, we wouldn't have enough food. We'd have much higher prices if the United States government would let us sell in the world market. And I think that condition is about what we're in for. Now that's a good thing for farmers, but it is an entirely different kind of world that we're living in now from what we lived before. I'm not sure you'll find a lot of economists that will agree with that, but that's the way it looks to me. So keep in mind this double-jointed turning point in history where we're in. One thing it says is we've got to do something different from what we've been doing. And I think the other thing it says is we can do something different. We've got a situation where there are things that we can do that we haven't had before. Now the question is, what are we going to do about it? Well, I think we can take a look at what's going on in our own American economy and get some clues about what we ought to do about it. For example, we have another big industry in the United States that's in trouble, the steel industry. We're not competitive in the world market. The Japanese and the Europeans are both underselling us in our own market, and we can't undersell them. We can't match them in the world market. So we got a serious steel problem. And the steel company out in Youngstown, Ohio just announced they're going to close down a plant and put 5,000 people out of work in one plant. And so what is our government going to do about it? Well, I happened to read an article about this in the New York Times when I flew out to South Dakota last Sunday, which reported that the average wage per hour in the American steel industry is $12.22 an hour. The average wage per hour in Japan is $6.31 an hour. Just almost double in the U.S. what it is in Japan. 100 hours of labor on steel in the steel industry in the United States will produce 8.5 tons of steel. That is a lot of steel. But 100 hours of labor at half the cost in Japan will produce 9.5 tons of steel. So is it any wonder that we're being undersold in the world market? And we know, of course, that the steel companies aren't losing as much money as farmers. They're getting a much better return on their investment than farmers are getting on their investment. But we don't have the Secretary of Labor in the Carter administration telling the steel workers, as Secretary Berglund did, that the price of steel ought to be such as would give them $2.67 an hour. There is no thought or no mention of this administration that the steel workers shouldn't get their $12.22 an hour. No suggestion that they ought to go down to $2.67, which is what the price support levels recommended by the Carter administration would yield to farmers. And we don't have the Secretary of Commerce telling the investors in the steel business that they ought to be willing to accept prices that would give them a 1.5% return on their investment, which is what Secretary Berglund said farmers should get on their investment in land. Now, if that's the game that our steel industry would play, we could undersell the Japanese, we could undersell the Germans, we could undersell everybody. We could take over the world market, just like we're doing with our grain. But that solution isn't advocated for our steel industry, which is a very important industry, just like our farming industry is. No, the Carter administration is taking steps to protect and preserve the levels of wages being earned by our steel workers, and to protect and preserve and promote the level of profits that's made by the investors in the steel business in this country. We're going to restrict imports. We're going to get some special tax advantages and some special loans and credit advantages and so forth to try to protect the position of our steel investors and our steel workers. What accounts for the difference? Why the diametrically different treatment of farmers from the treatment of steel business? The difference, I think, is that they're organized and we're not. The steel workers are organized into a union, a powerful union. Now, there aren't nearly as many steel workers in this country as there are farmers. We're only 4% of the population, and we think we're pretty small. But I don't suppose the steel workers are anything more than a small fraction of 1% of the population. But the steel workers have the electrical workers and the carpenters and the plumbers and all the rest of the union members ready and willing to back the protection of their price for their labor. And so that helps them. And there's even a smaller fraction of the population who are investors in the steel companies. They don't have many votes either. But they're organized into a powerful corporation, into just a handful of powerful corporations. And those powerful steel companies have the support of the rest of the business and financial community to measures that will protect the return on their investment. And the farmers are out of luck on both counts. We won't even defend each other, we farmers. We're more likely to have pork producers competing against beef producers, against soybean producers, and against milk producers, and so forth, with advertising programs and so forth, than we are to work together and to back each other across the board for a decent price for everybody. And we sure don't get much help from the financial community and the rest of the industrial community in backing us up for a decent return on our investment in farming. And the lesson in this, to me, is farmers have got to get organized. We are not organized. We're both over-organized and under-organized. The farmers of the United States are the most poorly organized farmers in any modern developed country. Yes, we've got commodity associations, we've got general farm organizations, we've got cooperatives, and what does it all add up to? The lowest real purchasing power for our product since the Depression. And that result isn't good enough. And that result is a black mark that says we're not well organized and we're not properly organized. In the Farmers Union, we have a symbol, the triangle, the action triangle. That's a symbol of the Farmers Union's action philosophy. The base is education. One side is cooperation, the other side is legislation. You all are familiar with that idea. You've seen it on letterheads and stationery and pamphlets and literature, and it's a very good symbol, and it represents a very good and valid program. Now, up until the 1930s, the Farmers Union concentrated on the cooperation side of the Action Triangle. The Farmers Union has started more cooperatives than everybody else in the United States put together. And that's a proud record, and it has done farmers a lot of good. At every place you drive in South Dakota, you see the signs of that work of our father's generation. And it's a great tribute to them and to the Farmers Union that they were able to get it done. But then along came the New Deal, and since then, we've been putting most of our emphasis on the legislation side of the Action Triangle. And we've done a lot of good there. It was Farmers Union leaders who got REA and farm credit and many other things, farm price support programs and many other things. Not all by ourselves, but it was Farmers Union people who were in the lead all the way through. And that has saved the family farmers who still survive. They wouldn't have survived without that effort. And it has built a valuable basis for programs in the future. And that is a great tribute also to the Farmers Union. But it hasn't enough. It isn't enough. It hasn't been enough, and it isn't enough in the future. Now I think we've got to crank up a powerful head of steam on both tracks. Simultaneously, the cooperation track and the political action track, and we've got to charge ahead as hard and fast as we can go down both roads at the same time. We've got to build a new generation of cooperation among farmers. We've got to organize a different kind of cooperatives, a kind of cooperatives that will enable us to get control of the supply of our product so that we can have something to say about the price we get for it, just like everybody else does, from the labor unions to the corporations. And at the same time, we're going to have to keep fired up a big head of steam on that other political action and legislation track, not only to continue to try to get the political benefits that we need and deserve, but also to protect what we'll try to do in a new drive down the cooperation track. I think that we have to do something different with our cooperatives than we've done before, and with cooperation. And I think we can take a look at the world around us and get another good illustration of what we might consider. About 15 years ago, I started becoming aware that the countries that export oil were beginning to look at what they might do to improve their situation. These countries had just recently become free of colonial domination. So they just recently gained possession of their land. And that's all they had. They didn't have any college graduates. They were illiterate. They had a high disease rate, a high mortality rate. They had no resources. They had no army. They had no navy. They were poor, backward countries. Didn't amount to much, and they didn't have much respect in the world. Now, does that sound familiar? Have you ever heard farmers describe themselves that way? Dumb farmers? You know, they don't count for much. Well, I've heard farmers describe themselves that way, and I've heard others describe farmers that way a good deal. And so these poor, dumb, backward countries looked at what they could do to improve their situation. Now, they might have looked at what we're doing with cooperatives in the United States. In the United States, our cooperatives have, and my father has helped to start the oil co-op back in Tripolo County, Wisconsin, in this era. And I can remember as a little boy hearing him tell about what he was driving at. We're going to build a cooperative that will have its own oil tanks and pumps and trucks to deliver petroleum, and then we're going to own our own oil wells, and we're going to work all the way back to the ground and squeeze the profit out of that marketing mechanism and get it back to the farmers. And we also belong to a cooperative creamery, and our aim there was to get all the way to the consumers. And Land O'Lakes is just about there. And we're going to squeeze the profit out of that marketing chain and get it back to the farmers. That's horizontal integration. And that's what our goal has been. Now, the Arabs might have looked at that model and figured that they already owned the land. They'd just been freed from colonial domination. They could easily have nationalized the oil wells and the pumps and the pipelines. They could have bought themselves a fleet of tankers and some refineries and a chain of filling stations and trained little Arabs how to pump gas, check oil, wipe windshields. They might have tried to organize and get control of their industry all the way from the ground to the consumer. And then if they could beat Exxon and Arco and all the big giants at their own game, where they'd had a couple of generations of experience, if they could outdo or at least match the big oil companies, they might have, with a little bit of luck, gotten about 5 cents a gallon back to Kuwait, the people in the country. 5 cents a gallon. But they didn't do it that way. They looked to their right and to their left. And they saw that 13 countries control 85% of all the supply of petroleum that moves in world trade. And they decided they're going to organize the control they already have of their product. And so they organized horizontally. And they got control. They organized the OPEC, Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries. They organized the supply of the control of the supply, and they didn't get 5 cents a gallon. They raised their price 5 times. And they made it stick because they had control of the supply, and they could set their own price. Just like the people that you buy from set their own price, you don't get much chance to dicker with them. And I think that's what we have to do with farmers. Farmers control practically 100% of the supply of their product before it leaves the farm. And that's where we have to organize. At the farm level, organize control of the supply. Now, that doesn't mean we abandon our vertically integrated cooperatives, not at all. A part of what we'll do if we can organize control of the supply of our product is to channel bigger volumes through the cooperatives that we already own and control and help to improve their performance. But also, we have to get control of the supply so that farmers, for a chain, can say, instead of what am I offered, here's what we want. We want parity. We want 90% of parity. We want 75% of parity. We want a fair rate of return, or however you want to define it. Like the labor unions say, we want, the coal miners say, we want, and then they write their price. They don't always get exactly everything they want, but at least they are in a position where they can bargain. Some farmers are doing that. I'm working with a committee representing the farm organizations in trying to write a bargaining bill for presentation to Congress in January. And I've gotten to meet and know the manager of a tomato growers cooperative out in California. They have something over 1,000 members. They don't control 100% of the tomatoes that are grown for freezing and or canning and making tomato soup. They control only about 60% of the tomatoes. But they control a big enough part of the supply so that they can bargain effectively for price. They started in operation 5 years ago when the price of tomatoes to farmers was $28 a ton. For the 1977 crop, they got $56.80 a ton, just a shade more than double. Now that's what farmers can do when they organize and bargain for a price. The Farmers Union has sponsored a Farmers Union milk marketing cooperative in Wisconsin that's organized on this principle. That is now the fastest growing dairy farmers cooperative in the world. It now has the second biggest dairy cooperative membership in the state of Wisconsin, which is the biggest single dairy producing state. It has members in Wisconsin, Minnesota, Iowa, Illinois, and Michigan. It is adding members at the rate of 125 to 150 dairy farmers per month. And it has a contract with every one of those farmers, giving the cooperative entire power to market the farmer's milk. Now controls several tens of millions of dollars worth of milk a year under marketing contracts. Now that co-op is not setting the world on fire as far as doubling the price of milk at this point. It requires the people that buy the milk to allow the cooperative's agent to check the tests, which is a very important service, because it is the butterfat test that determines how much the farmer is going to get for his milk, and it's very easy to fudge the test a little bit on the downside. And it is also developing the capability and beginning to practice bargaining plant by plant for better terms and conditions on what the farmers get for milk. And it is on the way to getting control of a major part of the supply of milk in this milk surplus producing area that includes your state of South Dakota and the rest of this region. And that puts it in a pivotal position to have a major influence on national dairy policy and on national milk prices. And this milk co-op is doing a great service for the Farmers Union. It provides in its bylaws that every member of that milk cooperative must be a member of the Farmers Union. And the farmers pay a marketing service fee to that co-op, and the first fees paid go to pay the dues of the farmer in the Farmers Union. It now pays dues for 5,000 members in the Farmers Union. And it's adding 100 to 125 to 150 new members a month to the Farmers Union. It's helping to build the Farmers Union. And that's a very important principle, because dairy farmers can't go it alone. We've got to get dairy farmers and beef producers and wheat farmers and soybean farmers and cotton growers all together under the umbrella of a general farm organization, so that we can understand each other's problems, so that we can resolve our conflicts, and there are conflicts between producers of different commodities, so that we can resolve them among ourselves, among us farmers, before we go public, so that when we do go public, we can present a united front for agriculture with our conflicts resolved and not have the public butting into our internal disputes. That's the purpose of the General Farm Organization. I don't think, however, that we can wait until the Farmers Union all by itself gets all the farmers organized into commodity by commodity bargaining associations, like we're trying to do with milk, as we're also trying to do with tomatoes in Ohio, in Indiana, and with dry beans in South Dakota and some of the other states in this area. I don't think family farming can be saved if we have to wait for the Farmers Union to do it all. And I don't think that family farming will be saved if we wait for the Farm Bureau to do it all, because I'm not even sure that they would want to try. I know that we would. And I don't think we can afford to wait for the Grange to do it or the NFO to do it. I guess some of us have waited 25 years for the NFO to do it. I think we've got to find a way whereby we can get farmers to work together on the things they agree about, while allowing them to go on disagreeing about the things they disagree about. And I think that is essential if we're going to save the family farm. And so I'm preaching the doctrine and trying to sell my colleagues in the Farmers Union on this idea that we should invite the other farm organizations to join us in trying to organize farmers. We should ask the Farm Bureau and the Grange and the NFO, help us, get together with us, let's organize the livestock producers, let's organize the dry bean producers, let's organize the tomato producers in Ohio and Indiana the way they are in California. Let's organize the wheat producers and the corn producers and the soybean producers into bargaining associations where we can organize and we can envision the possibility of organizing the control of a major part of the supply all across this country. And then we'll have real economic power, like the steel workers have. And we'll have real economic power like the investors in the steel companies have. And we can use that economic power to get political results, like the steel workers and the steel companies are getting in their difficulty. That'll protect us instead of say, we got to undersell the whole world and take less than the cost of production to do it. Then we'll have economic power and we can do things on our own hook and in our own way, like our businesses and trade unions are able to do. Then we will be able to say, we're going to have a farmer-controlled grain program. And a part of that is going to be we're going to carry the inventory that it takes to provide reliable service to our customers. Just like any businessman has got to have an inventory to back up his promise to his customers that they can depend on him for the stuff he sells when they need it. And we'll hold that inventory off the market until there's a bad year. We'll hold our own ever-normal granary under farmers' control. And we'll price our product today, when we've got a reserve in our inventory, at a price that's high enough to pay us to hold that inventory so it'll be there when we need it tomorrow. How do you think your J.I. Case dealer pays for the cost of holding his inventory of spare parts and having a tractor ready to sell to you as soon as you walk in and will need to buy it? How do you think he pays for it? The government doesn't pay storage and interest. He puts that on the price he charges you today. He puts that on the price he charges for the spare parts and service. That's a part of the cost of doing business. And farmers need to get organized so that we don't have to fuss around about who's subsidizing whom in our economy. Farmers have been subsidizing the world, farmers of the United States, for a long time. And it is absolutely infuriating, as much as it is untrue, that the government has ever subsidized us. We need to get farmers organized so that we can begin to be businessmen and get a decent return on our investment, our risk, our management, and for our work and our families' work. And I think that the way to do it is by getting the farm organizations together at last. Now, I'm willing to take my chances as a cattle producer in Wisconsin. I'm willing to take my chances with my neighbors who are Farm Bureau members, and we don't have any grangers. We have a few NFO members in our community. If they can get together, I'm willing to take my chances on what they will say about where we should price our feeder cattle. And I'm not too worried about what farmers will do if they ever get together and can work together about what's in their best interest. I don't think they're all going to agree, but I don't think that they'll disagree. If we can get them together into bargaining associations, I don't think they're going to disagree as fatally as we are bound to disagree under the present system. And so that is my proposition. I'm very interested in hearing what you think of it, what the possibilities might be, and I'll be glad now to listen to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Bob. Now we're going to proceed with the discussion period until noon.